The war in the Pacific began with distance, miles of ocean separating nations, illusions of safety drawn by the horizon. It ended when a silver-winged machine erased that distance. The P-51 Mustang was not just an aircraft. It was the embodiment of reach, of human will stretching beyond its own limits for the Japanese. Its arrival signaled the death of an era when courage alone could match technology, when the sky was a proving ground of spirit. For the Americans, it became a symbol of possibility, proof that mastery of design and endurance could change the course of a world war. In its polished reflection, both sides saw the future. The Mustang did not roar like vengeance. It hummed like inevitability. It was the sound of history accelerating, of a war moving toward its end. Whether humanity was ready or not, after the surrender, as peace settled over the Pacific, the same aircraft that once brought destruction began flying mercy missions, guiding lost planes home, mapping coastlines, carrying supplies to starving villages. The same wings that had conquered became wings that healed. It was as if the sky itself sought redemption. Decades later, when veterans gather at airfields and the last surviving Mustangs rise into the sun once more, people still look up. They see not just a machine, but a symbol of how far humankind can go when necessity demands and imagination dares. Its engine's growl is the echo of every battle fought for the freedom to reach beyond the horizon. In the end, the P-51's legacy is not written only in victories or numbers, but in silence, in the moment after the last sortie. When the world looked up and realized that distance, once a barrier between nations, had become a bridge between generations, the laughter that once greeted America's early fighters faded long ago. What remained was respect for the men who flew, for the engineers who dreamed, and for the machine that turned the tides of history. The Mustang did not just win the air war, it redefined the meaning of the sky. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the silence over its cities was almost sacred. For months, the people had lived beneath the sound of war, bombers roaring, sirens wailing, engines screaming. Now, there was only wind. And in that silence lay the shadow of the machine that had delivered the final blow to Japan's air power, the North American P-51 Mustang. As American forces occupied the islands, airfields once filled with wreckage became museums of defeat. Burned Ki-84s and shattered Zeros lay beside immaculate P-51s parked in rows, symbols of a new age. For the Japanese, the contrast was unbearable. The enemy's aircraft gleamed like instruments of the future, while their own machines belonged to a fading past. At Tachikawa, a captured Mustang was examined by stunned Japanese engineers. They marveled at its design, its laminar flow wing, its cooling system, its perfect balance of speed and range. One of them whispered to a translator, "It is not a plane. It is evolution itself." He wasn't wrong. The Mustang had not merely won a war, it had redefined aerial warfare. Before the Mustang, air supremacy was local, a question of control over specific regions. After the Mustang, it became global. No longer was the ocean a barrier. It was just another distance to cross. The lessons learned from those long-range missions over Japan changed the way every major power thought about air strategy. The concept of range, once the Achilles heel of fighters, became the centerpiece of modern design. It was the foundation upon which post-war jet programs were built. The F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15, and even the first nuclear-capable bombers all carried the Mustang's legacy in their blueprints. In many ways, the P-51 was the first true global fighter, the bridge between the propeller age and the coming jet revolution. For the men who flew it, the war's end brought mixed emotions. Some returned home as heroes, decorated and celebrated. Others carried the quiet burden of memory, of 7-hour flights over empty seas, of enemies who never came back. Many veterans described a haunting emptiness in the final months of the war. Without opposition, the missions felt mechanical, almost ritualistic. Captain Charles McGee, who flew both in Europe and the Pacific, later said, "Victory didn't feel like triumph. It felt like silence, like the world had stopped breathing for a moment. Yet even in that silence, There was reverence for the aircraft that had carried them farther than any fighter before, and for the men who never returned from those long flights home. In post-war Japan, the realization of technological defeat was profound. The Empire's engineers had produced brilliant aircraft, the Zero, the Shiden, the Hayate, but they were products of a philosophy bound by geography. Their designs favored agility and range suitable for island defense, not intercontinental reach. The Mustang exposed that flaw completely. When Japan began rebuilding its industry in the 1950s, American air doctrine became its model. Ironically, the same principles that destroyed its air force became the foundation of its rebirth. Mustangs themselves were later used by the Japan Air Self-Defense Force for training. The very aircraft that had once darkened their skies now guarded their peace. The P-51 outlived the war by decades. It fought in Korea, served in countless air forces worldwide, and became a legend at air shows and museums, a living echo of a time when speed, courage, and innovation converged perfectly. Its polished fuselage reflected not just sunlight, but the story of human determination to go farther, faster, higher than ever thought possible. For the historians who studied the Pacific War, one conclusion became clear: without the Mustang, the bombing campaign over Japan would have been slower, costlier, and perhaps delayed the war's end. The aircraft shortened the agony, even as it magnified the destruction. It was both savior and scourge, a paradox of progress. By September 1945, as peace returned, the P-51 squadrons on Iwo Jima stood down. Engines cooled for the last time. The men walked the same runways where months earlier they had launched into fire and smoke. Now the air was calm, the horizon empty. Photographs from that period show pilots standing beside their Mustangs, arms crossed, expressions distant. Behind them, Mount Suribachi looms under a quiet sky. The war that had begun with laughter at America's slow, heavy fighters ended with silence beneath their wings. The Mustang had flown from England to Berlin, from Iwo Jima to Tokyo, across oceans, continents, and into history itself. It was not just a weapon. It was the proof that human ingenuity could close the greatest distances, both in miles and in imagination. By July 1945, the skies over Japan were eerily quiet. For the first time in nearly a decade of war, the Empire had no shield, no roar of defenders, no promise of resistance. Only the distant hum of approaching engines, American engines, signaled the rhythm of defeat. Every morning, from Iwo Jima and Saipan, waves of B-29s rose like clockwork. Above them, the Mustangs took position, sleek and confident, sweeping the air routes ahead. There were no longer dogfights, no sudden ambushes from Japanese fighters. Instead, there was only precision, mission after mission completed, almost uncontested. Tokyo, once a fortress of smoke and anti-aircraft fire, had become an open wound. The raids of March and April had destroyed nearly half the city's urban area. By summer, the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey recorded that over 60 Japanese cities had been partially or completely flattened. Nearly 8.5 million people were left homeless, and above it all, the P-51 Mustangs flew on, their propellers slicing through a defeated sky. What the Mustang achieved went beyond mere escort duty. It changed the very mathematics of war. Before its arrival, B-29 formations suffered catastrophic losses, sometimes as high as 8% per mission. Without fighter cover, every raid was a gamble. But after the introduction of the P-51 from Iwo Jima, those losses fell below 2%. This shift allowed General Curtis LeMay to pursue a new strategy: low-altitude, nighttime firebombing. With their superiority guaranteed, bombers could operate at altitudes and times once considered suicidal. The Mustang didn't just protect, it enabled an entirely new level of destruction. From that moment, Japan's defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. For the Japanese people, the Mustangs were both terrifying and surreal. Eyewitnesses recalled seeing them so low that they could recognize the white stars on their wings. Children pointed at the sky as silver flashes streaked past, faster than anything they had ever seen. In rural areas, farmers watched as single fighters strafed trains and bridges with ruthless precision. The sound of 8.50 caliber guns became a signal that the war was lost, one Tokyo survivor later said. Before, the bombers came and went. But when the Mustangs arrived, we knew we were truly conquered. They ruled even the air we breathed. Even Japanese propaganda, once defiant, began to falter. Radio Tokyo stopped claiming 10 enemy planes destroyed after each raid. The reality was too obvious, too overwhelming. Yet for the Americans, the Mustang's triumph came at a human cost as well. Though losses were minimal compared to earlier campaigns, each mission pushed both men and machines to their limits. Fuel starvation was common. Exhaustion, even more so. Flying 7-hour sorties over open ocean meant constant tension, one mistake, one mechanical failure, and a pilot would vanish without trace. Rescue submarines and picket ships dotted the Pacific to recover downed flyers, but many were never found. Each missing pilot was a reminder that even supremacy had its price. The mechanics, too, paid their share. On Iwo Jima, men worked through volcanic dust, heat, and exhaustion to keep the engines alive. Every takeoff covered them in grit and ash. The Mustang's polished beauty in the air came from brutal labor on the ground. By late summer, Japanese intercepts had all but ceased. Out of the 12,000 aircraft Japan once boasted at the height of its empire, fewer than 1,000 remained operational by August 1945. Fuel stocks had dwindled to the point where only kamikaze units received allocations. For every pilot ready to fly, there were 10 who waited in grounded aircraft, powerless. Even the most devoted aces admitted defeat. Captain Tadashi Nakajima, who had once mocked the early American fighters in 1942, was grounded by May 1945. He later told a war correspondent, "It was not courage we lacked, it was hope." The sky no longer answered us. The once proud airfields, Tachikawa, Chofu, Yokota, were now graveyards of twisted metal. Rows of aircraft sat motionless, their wings sagging under the weight of surrender. By the time the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August, the outcome was already written in the clouds above. The Mustangs had stripped Japan of its eyes and claws. When the Enola Gay took off from Tinian on August 6th, it did so without a single Japanese fighter able to intercept it. The airspace over the empire was empty, a void that echoed the end of an era. The P-51 had not only changed the war, it had changed the way war itself was fought. Distance no longer protected, speed no longer guaranteed safety. For the first time in history, a single-engine fighter could reach across oceans, dominate continents, and return home. By April 1945, the Japanese skies had changed forever. Once, Tokyo's air raid alarms had signaled a furious defense, squadrons scrambling, engines howling, machine guns bristling from rooftops. Now, when the sirens wailed, there was often no one left to fight. The Mustangs of Iwo Jima flew daily, sleek silver ghosts that arrived at dawn and vanished by dusk. Their missions expanded beyond escort duty. They now hunted. Rail yards, airfields, convoys, even individual locomotives became targets. To the Japanese, the word Mustang became synonymous with death from nowhere. At Tachikawa, one of Tokyo's main air bases, the 15th Fighter Group arrived in low-level attack formation. Their drop tanks had been jettisoned miles earlier. Now they dove at 400 miles per hour, guns blazing. Hangars erupted in flame. Rows of parked aircraft, many without fuel or trained pilots, were shredded in seconds. From a distance, it looked like chaos. From above, it was systematic, a precise elimination of air power, one field at a time. The Imperial Japanese Army Air Force IJAAF had been built on pride, skill, and discipline. But by spring 1945, it faced an enemy it could neither outfight nor outlast. Japan's best pilots, veterans of China and the early Pacific campaigns, had been lost years earlier. Their replacements, barely trained, took to the skies in worn-out Ki-43s and Ki-84s, many with failing engines or cracked tires. Fuel was scarce. Oil stocks were nearly gone. Entire squadrons received orders to stay grounded except in emergencies when the Americans came. The few who took off often did so with fatal resolve, some turning their planes into guided bombs, attempting ramming attacks against the B-29s or the Mustangs. But even this last act of desperation faltered. The Mustangs, faster and better armed, cut them down before they could strike. Every failed sortie deepened Japan's despair. One Japanese officer later wrote in his diary, "Our young men fly because they are told to, not because they believe they will return. The sky is no longer ours." For the American pilots, there was a strange duality to their victories. They knew the Mustangs were unmatched, but they also saw what it meant. Every dogfight became shorter, every enemy formation smaller. Some raids encountered no resistance at all. It was triumph wrapped in melancholy. Captain Robert DeHaven of the 7th Fighter Command later recalled, "At first, you'd look forward to seeing them, the enemy. Then, suddenly, they were gone. You start to realize you're not fighting men anymore. You're finishing a nation." In Tokyo, civilians stared helplessly at the contrails above, the silver streaks that meant death would come before noon. Even children learned to identify the difference between bombers and fighters. "B-san, M-san," they whispered. The B-29 and the Mustang, one dropped fire. The other killed the defenders trying to stop it on the night of March 9th to 10th. 1945, the U.S. Army Air Forces launched Operation Meeting House, the single most destructive bombing raid in history. Over 100,000 people perished in a few hours, though the attack was carried out by B-29s. Its success depended on the Mustangs that had cleared the skies days earlier. By ensuring that no Japanese fighter could threaten the bomber streams, the P-51s turned Tokyo into an undefended target. And from that point onward, the pattern was irreversible. Every week, another city burned: Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. Each mission was guarded by the silver-winged fighters that had once been dismissed as incapable of reaching Japan. Now, they circled like sentinels, watching, protecting, ensuring nothing rose from the ground. By May 1945, the air war was no longer a contest. It was a one-sided annihilation. Japanese aircraft production fell by more than 50% in 3 months. The last operational fighter units were moved north, desperately trying to shield what remained of the homeland. But even Hokkaido and northern Honshu soon saw the Mustang's shadow when Japan's final Ki-84s were destroyed in June. The Imperial High Command quietly stopped issuing sortie orders for most airfields. Instead, resources shifted to anti-aircraft guns and balloon defenses, desperate measures with no real hope. In the words of one American report, "Enemy air resistance over Japan has ceased to be a factor. The long-range escort had achieved what entire fleets could not. It had broken Japan's capacity to fight in the air." By summer, the Mustangs flew without opposition. Their pilots returned to Iwo Jima with gun barrels still cool. Some said the silence in their headphones was more haunting than the sound of combat. The adrenaline was gone. Only the enormity of what had been done remained. The P-51 had carried the war to the heart of Japan and had taken something intangible from it, its spirit of invincibility. For every Japanese pilot who once mocked American fighters as heavy and slow, the final truth had arrived on wings of polished aluminum and the roar of a Rolls-Royce Merlin. The sky, once their domain, now belonged to someone else. Iwo Jima, March 1945. The airfield is a scarred wasteland of volcanic ash and twisted metal. Yet, from this black soil, history is about to take flight. At dawn, the first P-51D Mustangs of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups line up, engines growling in the smoky air. Their mission, to escort hundreds of B-29 Superfortresses bound for Tokyo, the first full-scale bomber raid with fighter cover all the way to the target and back, until now. American bombers had fought their way across 1,500 miles of ocean unprotected. Dozens of aircraft lost to interceptors and flak, each loss a symbol of distance, of isolation. But today, The Mustang will erase that distance. Major James B. Tapp, commander of the 78th Fighter Squadron, grips his throttle. His men call him Red for the streak of determination in both his temper and his P-51's markings. Beside him, his wingman checks instruments, oxygen, fuel, ammo, all at the limit of endurance. When the tire light flashes green, 36 silver fighters surge forward, wheels biting the ash before lifting into the morning haze. From their cockpits, the pilots can already see the massive shadows of the B-29s forming above, engines droning, glinting in the sunlight like a moving fortress of aluminum. For the first time, those bombers are not alone. The route from Iwo Jima to Tokyo stretched nearly 700 miles one way, 7 hours of flight, half of it over open sea. To conserve fuel, pilots flew in tight formations, throttled back, and often glided part of the way. Every mile was a test of concentration and stamina. One engine failure, one compass glitch, one navigation error, and the ocean below became a grave dot by the time the formation reached Japan's coast. The fuel gauges were already dipping dangerously low. But the mission's timing was perfect. The B-29s arrived just as Japanese air defenses scrambled dot at 20,000 feet. The first Ki-84s appeared, rising in pairs from Chofu and Tachikawa airfields. Japanese radar had spotted the bombers but underestimated the escorts. To them, the small radar echoes trailing the bombers seemed too light, too scattered to be fighters. They were wrong. Within moments, the Mustangs rolled inverted and dove from the sun, streaks of silver cutting through the clouds. Captain John Benbow, a 24-year-old from Michigan, locked eyes on a Ki-40 for Tojo banking hard left. The Japanese pilot tried to pull into a vertical climb, the traditional move to force an overshoot. But Benbow's Mustang followed effortlessly, its Merlin engine screaming past 4,000 RPM. A burst of .50 caliber fire struck home, flashes, then a curl of smoke. The Tojo spiraled downward, vanishing into the haze below. Moments later, Benbow's wingman shouted over the radio, 12 o'clock high, Zeros inbound. The sky erupted. Contrails twisted like ribbons, tracers slicing across the sunlight. Dozens of Zeros charged the bomber stream, trying to cut through the Mustang screen. They never made it. Every pass ended in a thunder of Brownings. Within minutes, 8 enemy aircraft were down. Others broke formation, diving for cover below the clouds, something unthinkable just months before. Below, Tokyo burned. The B-29s released thousands of tons of incendiaries across the city's industrial wards, flames merging into a single red glow that could be seen from 150 miles away. For the Japanese pilots still airborne, the reflection of that inferno illuminated the silver P-51s circling above, untouchable. Relentless, American airmen would later call it the day the sky turned orange. It wasn't just from the fire. It was the reflection of dominance, of an enemy's will collapsing. One Japanese survivor, Lieutenant Saburo Endo, later wrote in his memoir, "We flew into the sun to blind the Americans. But it was we who were blinded, not by light but by despair. Their fighters were everywhere, and we could not reach them." From that day, Endo's squadron ceased to exist as an effective unit. Fuel shortages and constant losses forced them to merge with other remnants. The Empire's one Sprout air defense had become a shadow, but victory had its cost. The Mustang pilots who returned to Iwo Jima landed with trembling hands and empty fuel tanks. Many touched down with less than 5 gallons remaining, a razor's edge between triumph and loss. Some never made it back at all, lost in the endless Pacific, their radios fading into static. Lieutenant Richard Turner, whose engine failed on the return leg, ditched near a rescue destroyer. He later said, "When you're floating out there, watching the last light fade, you realize the sky owns you, not the other way around." The Air War's climax was not just about superiority. It was about endurance, will, and faith in a machine that had redefined what was possible. When the first reports reached Washington, the news electrified the command. The P-51s had not only escorted the bombers safely, they had destroyed more than 80 enemy aircraft with only a handful lost. For the first time, the air over Japan was contested and won. On American terms, LeMay's staff noted that bomber accuracy had doubled on escorted missions. Confidence surged. By late March, long-range Mustang sweeps began to target airfields directly, striking at the roots of Japan's air defense network. Runways were cratered, hangars burned, fuel depots erased. The Japanese home islands, once thought impregnable, were now open to unrelenting daylight attacks. And across the Pacific, the world took notice. The P-51 Mustang had done what no fighter in history had achieved. It had made the impossible distance disappear. War in the air is rarely won by machines alone. It is won by vision, by men who see beyond the horizon. For the Pacific Air Campaign, that vision came from the relentless mind of General Curtis E. LeMay when he took command of the 21 Bomber Command in January 1945. Morale was fragile. The B-29s were performing daring, exhausting missions from the Marianas, but results were erratic. LeMay changed everything, from altitude to escort tactics, and his philosophy was brutal in its clarity. If we can reach them, we can break them. He demanded that the new P-51D Mustangs be integrated immediately once Iwo Jima was secured. Pilots were ordered to fly through storms, through anti-aircraft belts, through the fatigue of 7-hour missions. LeMay's coordination with Admiral Nimitz and General Hop Arnold ensured that every captured island became a launch point for sustained pressure. Airfields turned from isolated outposts into springboards aimed directly at Japan's heart. On the Japanese side, leadership struggled to adapt. The Imperial Army Air Service and the Navy Air Service operated separately, their doctrines rarely aligned. Even as Mustangs began to appear, coordination between radar stations, intercept commands, and air bases lagged. Some Japanese commanders clung to the belief that divine intervention, not industrial reorganization, would turn the tide. By the time orders reached frontline squadrons, the situation above Tokyo had already changed. LeMay's strategic gamble that long-range escort could make daylight raids sustainable paid off with cold precision. He had transformed a costly bombing campaign into an unbroken offensive, and though his methods were controversial, few doubted their effectiveness. The Mustang was his instrument of execution for the defenders of Japan. The arrival of the P-51 was more than a new aircraft. It was the erosion of everything familiar. In the early war years, they had fought at ranges where every fight was personal. The flash of eyes through canopies, the smell of oil and cordite, the feel of control sticks vibrating in a dive. Now they faced an enemy that appeared without warning, struck from the sun, and vanished faster than any pursuit could follow. The Imperial Japanese Air Defense Command scrambled every resource it had. Fighters like the Ki-84s, Ki-100, and the Navy's A6M50 were pressed into home defense. But fuel was scarce, spare parts scarcer, and radar coverage fragmented. Ground crews worked under bombing alerts. Pilots slept beside their aircraft, ready to launch within minutes. They painted slogans on their fuselages, "For the Emperor, 10,000 years of victory." As morale cracked under exhaustion, when the Mustangs arrived, traditional tactics failed instantly. Their own planes, optimized for turn fighting, couldn't match the Mustang's climb or dive speed. Intercept attempts devolved into chaos. Scattered duels across the Kanto skies. American formations flew in disciplined pairs and quartets, covering each other's tails with mechanical precision. For Japanese veterans, it was shocking to see such coordination in enemy barbarians. For younger pilots, it was simply overwhelming. As losses mounted, Japan's air strategy shifted toward the desperate. Kamikaze missions, originally directed at ships, began to include ramming attacks on bombers and fighters. The symbolism of sacrifice replaced the logic of air combat. To many on the ground, these suicide attacks seemed both heroic and tragic, a nation's final stand written in contrails, but the truth was clear to every pilot who survived a sortie. The air over Tokyo now belonged to the Americans. Below those duels, the city itself became the silent witness. Tokyo in 1945 was a labyrinth of wooden homes, narrow alleys, and weary faces. Each morning brought new waves of air raid sirens, each night the glow of burning wards. Civilians learned to read the sky. The deep rumble of engines meant bombers. The sharper roar meant fighters. When the Mustangs first appeared, their presence was surreal. They moved with a predatory grace, diving at rooftop level, strafing airfields, railways, and factories. For the people of Tokyo, it was the end of distance. The war was no longer a faraway struggle in the Pacific. It was above their heads in the smoke and the sunlight. Eyewitnesses recalled children pointing upward, shouting "Teki," enemy. Some wept. Others watched in silence as the silver aircraft rolled through the clouds. Many had once believed Japan invincible. Now they saw with their own eyes the Empire's defenders falling in flames. For American pilots, these low-level passes brought conflicting emotions. They saw the immense sprawl of Tokyo, the rivers, bridges, tram lines, and knew every bullet they fired would strike not just soldiers, but workers, homes, lives. Some returned to Iwo Jima silent for hours after landing. Even hardened veterans described an unease that crept in as the city burned beneath them. Technology had given them reach. Morality reminded them of the cost. By the spring of 1945, the transformation was complete. The sky that had once been Japan's shield had become its greatest vulnerability. Above the rising smoke, contrails stretched white against the blue, the unmistakable sign that the age of the Mustang had begun. For the men who flew, war was measured in heartbeats, not miles. Japanese fighter pilots had once been the elite of Asia, hand-picked, superbly trained, and filled with the conviction that skill and spirit outweighed machinery. But by 1945, the faces inside their cockpits were younger, thinner, and far less prepared. Many had less than 100 hours of flight time before combat. Fuel shortages limited training, and even experienced aces struggled to pass on their knowledge as attrition devoured their ranks. In contrast, the Americans of the 21st and 506th Fighter Groups were well-fed, well-trained, and backed by the world's most powerful logistics machine. They carried photographs of sweethearts taped to instrument panels, lucky tokens on dashboards, the small rituals of men who knew their odds. But unlike Europe, the Pacific offered no soft landing, no friendly fields. If a Mustang went down over Japan, the pilot vanished into hostile territory or the sea. Every sortie was a gamble against distance, weather, and exhaustion. Many recalled the surreal beauty of those flights, endless blue, the horizon curving like the edge of the world. Then, the sudden flash of tracer fire. A Japanese pilot once described seeing a silver flash diving like a hawk. That flash, he learned too late, was AP-51. The skies over Tokyo became a mirror, reflecting courage and fear in equal measure. For Japanese defenders, it was disbelief that such an enemy could reach them. For American pilots, it was the haunting realization that every victory was also destruction of men not so different from themselves. The mission profile for the P-51 over Japan was unlike any fighter operation in history. From Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back meant nearly 1,500 miles round trip, 6 to 7 hours in a cramped cockpit, navigating by compass, fuel gauge, and hope. Pilots took off before dawn, climbing in tight formations over the Pacific. Drop tanks extended their range, but they also made the aircraft heavy and sluggish until emptied. Discipline, not aggression, defined success. Each flight followed a carefully timed sequence. The first wave would meet the B-29S midway to Japan. Once within visual range, the Mustangs formed protective arcs above and beside the bombers. They flew in weave patterns, crisscrossing above the formation to deter interceptors. Fuel checks came every few minutes. A single miscalculation meant death by drowning on the return leg. When Japanese interceptors appeared, the formation split into layered defense. Some pilots stayed with the bombers. Others broke off to engage. At high altitude, the Mustang's Merlin engine thrived where Japanese radials struggled. Speed and climb were decisive. Dogfights that once favored agile Zeros now ended with them burning before completing a turn, yet tactics evolved on both sides. Japanese pilots learned to dive from above, conserving energy, firing in one pass, and escaping. They also turned increasingly to kamikaze tactics, ramming B-29s or attacking escorting fighters when ammunition ran out. For the Americans, this new desperation was terrifying. The line between combat and suicide blurred in the cold, thin air above Tokyo. Still, mission after mission, the discipline of escort held. LeMay's doctrine was clear: protect the bombers. Bring them home. By summer 1945, losses among B-29s had dropped sharply. The Mustangs had achieved what strategy alone could not: air control over Japan's own capital. The mission profile for the P-51 over Japan was unlike any fighter operation in history. From Iwo Jima to Tokyo and back meant nearly 1,500 miles round trip, 6 to 7 hours in a cramped cockpit, navigating by compass, fuel gauge, and hope. Pilots took off before dawn, climbing in tight formations over the Pacific. Drop tanks extended their range, but they also made the aircraft heavy and sluggish until emptied. Discipline, not aggression, defined success. Each flight followed a carefully timed sequence. The first wave would meet the B-29s midway to Japan. Once within visual range, the Mustangs formed protective arcs above and beside the bombers. They flew in weave patterns, crisscrossing above the formation to deter interceptors. Fuel checks came every few minutes. A single miscalculation meant death by drowning on the return leg. When Japanese interceptors appeared, the formation split into layered defense. Some pilots stayed with the bombers. Others broke off to engage. At high altitude, the Mustang's Merlin engine thrived where Japanese radials struggled. Speed and climb were decisive. Dogfights that once favored agile Zeros now ended with them burning before completing a turn, yet tactics evolved on both sides. Japanese pilots learned to dive from above, conserving energy, firing in one pass, and escaping. They also turned increasingly to kamikaze tactics, ramming B-29s or attacking escorting fighters when ammunition ran out. For the Americans, this new desperation was terrifying. The line between combat and suicide blurred in the cold, thin air above Tokyo. Still, mission after mission, the discipline of escort held. LeMay's doctrine was clear: protect the bombers. Bring them home. By summer 1945, losses among B-29s had dropped sharply. The Mustangs had achieved what strategy alone could not: air control over Japan's own capital. The P-51's legend was built not just on courage but on chemistry and steel. Its breakthrough lay in the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a 12-cylinder masterpiece combining British design with American manufacturing muscle. This engine transformed the Mustang from a short-range escort into the long-range predator that reached Tokyo at cruising power. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger allowed efficient high-altitude flight, while the laminar flow wing minimized drag across the Pacific's endless miles. Fuel efficiency was astonishing. A pilot could throttle back to 1,800 RPM, sip fuel, and still keep pace with the bombers below. Coupled with twin 165-gallon drop tanks, the P-51D's operational range extended beyond 1,600 miles. It was no longer just a fighter. It was a bridge between continents. Armament was simple but devastating: 6.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, each fed by 400 rounds. Against the lightly built Japanese aircraft, a 1-second burst could shred wings and fuselage alike. American gunnery training emphasized precision, short, disciplined bursts at convergence range, not wasteful sprays. Equally critical was navigation. Flying over endless ocean, pilots relied on primitive homing beacons, dead reckoning, and astronomical fixes. One clouded compass or failed radio could doom an entire flight. Yet, advances in radio direction finding and long range. Homing meant formations could now find their bombers and home base with uncanny reliability. When the first Mustangs landed back on Iwo Jima after their maiden escort, their engines ticking as they cooled, mechanics and ground crews crowded around in silence, they knew something fundamental had changed. For the first time, the United States could strike Japan's heart at will and return safely. By the autumn of 1944, the Pacific War had reached its most brutal rhythm. From the Marianas Islands, the newly formed 20th Air Force began its high-altitude bombing campaign with the B-29 Superfortress, the largest and most advanced bomber in the world. Its pressurized cabin, remote-controlled turrets, and immense range symbolized American industrial might. But over Japan, it was often alone, a silver fortress surrounded by flame. The Japanese called them B-san, Mr. B, and adapted every interceptor they had to bring them down. The Ki-40 Shoki and Ki-84 Hayate climbed desperately to meet the bombers. Pilots learned to attack from head-on, firing their 20mm cannon and diving away before escorting fighters could intervene because there were none. For months, the skies above Tokyo were duels between enormous bombers and lone interceptors, a deadly theater of altitude, courage, and inevitability. American commanders knew this couldn't last. Losses were climbing, accuracy was poor, and weather over the home islands often scattered formations. General Curtis LeMay, newly appointed to command the 21st Bomber Command, understood that to break Japan's will, the raids had to be relentless and protected. The question was how to project fighter cover across more than 1,500 miles of open ocean. That answer took shape in black volcanic soil. The assault on Iwo Jima began on February 19, 1945, a battle so savage that it seemed detached from logic. The island, just 8 square miles of rock, was defended by nearly 20,000 Japanese troops under General Tadamichi Kurabayashi. Every cave, every tunnel, every slope of Mount Suribachi became a fortress. But behind the carnage lay a purpose invisible to many of the men dying there. Airfields, 3 of them, carved by American engineers under relentless fire, would give birth to a new phase of air war. By early March, Airfield No. 1 was operational. It lay just over 650 miles from Tokyo, close enough for Mustangs to escort B-29s, loiter, fight, and still return with fuel to spare. The price was terrible, nearly 7,000 Marines dead, but strategically. Iwo Jima became the stepping stone to the Japanese capital while the battle raged. In depots across the Pacific, crated P-51 discs were being assembled. Their sleek wings, long fuselages, and powerful Merlin engines had already proved themselves in Europe. But now they were modified for endurance, twin 165-gallon drop tanks, tuned carburetors, and extra radio gear for long over-water navigation. Pilots of the 15th, 21st, and 506th Fighter Groups began their training for the longest escort missions in history. Their doctrine evolved under pressure. Each squadron rehearsed assembly climbs, rendezvous patterns, and fuel discipline to the minute. At briefing huts on Saipan and later Iwo Jima, commanders drew chalk lines across maps of the Pacific, outward route, rendezvous altitude, entry over the target, withdrawal headings. Everything was timed to the second because over Japan, there was no margin for error. By March 1945, the first squadrons began to move forward. On the night of March 4th, the first P-51 disc from Iwo Jima escorted a formation of B-29s on a reconnaissance mission over the Tokyo area. It was a small-scale operation, but historically, it marked the first time American fighters had appeared over the Japanese capital. The next day, photographs returned showing smoke, wreckage, and the unmistakable outline of a Mustang diving through cloud. The psychological shift had begun. Japanese intelligence was stunned. Reports described new enemy single-engine aircraft operating at extreme range, believed at first to have launched from carriers. But there were no fleets offshore, only the black spakes of Iwo Jima. For the first time, the Imperial General Headquarters realized that Japan's skies were no longer an inviolable shield. Every airfield, every factory, every city could now be reached and contested out in daylight. In the weeks that followed, the long-range escort system matured. Each B-9 formation would be met by waves of Mustangs halfway to the target. Then, as fuel ran low, one wave would turn back while another relieved it. a seamless relay of steel and discipline. It was a choreography of distance never before attempted in war. The Japanese, watching their radar screens flicker, didn't yet know the scale of what was coming. For months, they had laughed at the idea of American fighters reaching their homeland. But the laughter was fading. They were about to face a new enemy, faster, higher, and more relentless than anything they had known. The sky was changing color, and soon it would belong to the Mustangs. In the first years of the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy Air Services stood unmatched across Asia. Their fighters, the Mitsubishi A6M0, the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, embodied the spirit of the warrior in the sky, light, agile, and deadly at close range. From the jungles of Malaya to the coral skies of the Philippines, allied pilots learned to fear their maneuverability and precision. Japan's flyers had been honed in China since the late 1930s. They were combat-seasoned, confident, and revered at home. By 1942, they believed their air discipline, Senjinken, the code of fighting to the death, would keep the empire untouchable. Across the Pacific, American airmen faced a harsher truth. Their P-40 Warhawks, P-39 Airacobras, and P-38 Lightnings could hold their own in specific engagements but lacked the range to project power over the vast oceanic distances that defined the Pacific theater. To strike Japan's heart was a dream measured in thousands of miles and gallons of fuel. The U.S. did not yet know how to carry DOT by 1943. The balance began to bend. Industrial output surged in American factories, engines, airframes, and training. Programs turned out machines faster than Japan could replace pilots. But even as the B-17s and later B-29 Superfortresses rolled off the assembly lines, the essential link was missing, a fighter that could escort them all the way to the target and back. Japan's own defensive posture evolved slowly. The Imperial Navy still believed in decisive battle, the fleet engagement that would annihilate the enemy in one glorious strike. The Army Air Force remained focused on tactical defense of the home islands and forward bases, relying on short-range interceptors optimized for climb and agility. They did not imagine that one day they would need to contest the skies above, their own capital against foreign fighters with nearly double the range of their best designs. Meanwhile, in Britain and the United States, aircraft designers pursued a dangerous dream to merge endurance with speed. At North American Aviation, a new fighter design, sleek and long-bodied, was maturing through test flights in California. Initially powered by an Allison engine and intended for export, the aircraft showed promise but not brilliance. Then came a moment of engineering alchemy, fitting it with the British-designed Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The result transformed the prototype into something extraordinary, the P-51 Mustang, capable of high performance at altitude and astonishing efficiency over long distances. In 1944, Mustangs began to dominate the skies over Europe. Flying from English bases, they escorted bombers deep into Germany, over the Ruhr, Berlin, Leipzig. Pilots spoke of how the Merlin purred even at 30,000 feet and of how German fighters once confident in home skies found themselves hunted instead. The formula was proven. Speed, range, and disciplined escort tactics could dismantle an enemy's air defense from within, but the Pacific remained another world. The Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa lay thousands of miles from Tokyo. American planners faced an arithmetic of distance. No fighter in service could escort bombers from those islands and return safely. The early raids by B-29s from China and the Marianas had shown promise but suffered unsustainable losses. Without fighter cover, the massive bombers became slow targets for nimble Japanese interceptors. By late 1944, Japanese pilots, despite heavy attrition, still laughed at reports of new American fighters rumored to be coming. No U.S. aircraft, they reasoned, could carry enough fuel to reach Tokyo, fight, and return. Their home skies would remain sovereign, or so they believed, yet, far to the south, construction crews and engineers were turning volcanic rock into lifelines. On the black sands of Iwo Jima, Seabees and Marines carved airstrips at staggering cost, paving the way for the unthinkable. An American fighter base within reach of the Empire's capital. The stage was nearly set. What remained was the final alignment of logistics, leadership, and technology that would turn the dream of long-range escort into reality. Tokyo, March 1945. Dawnlight crawls over the Kanto Plain, touching the rising smoke of burned-out districts. In the distance, the sirens begin again. High above the haze, the defenders of the Imperial City climb through thin air. Nakajima Ki-84s and Ki-44s, their engines straining, condensation streaking their wingtips. They had faced B-29s before. Massive, slow, predictable. Easy prey, or so they once believed, but this morning feels different. From the glare of the sun, silver shapes emerge. Sleek, fast, predatory. They aren't bombers. They're fighters, and they're still climbing. The Japanese pilots glance at their altimeters, 25,000 feet, and stare in disbelief. No American fighter had ever come this far. None could stay this long. The new arrivals dive through the formation, guns flashing, 8 Brownings tearing the sky. In seconds, pride turns to panic, smoke, and spiraling metal. Below, Tokyo's people look up and see an unfamiliar silhouette chasing the defenders away. The Mustang had arrived. And from that morning on, the war over Japan would never be the same.